What's up, everybody? Okay, this is the context unit screencast. As I may or may not have said in class, the context unit it's probably not going to have now how small the AP test is. It's probably not likely that there will be a question from this context unit. However, the College Board has left open the possibility because our first unit is supposed to start in circa 120, and with that we know that that word circa means around, and so we could have questions from before the year 1200, before that time period. And so we really need to understand just what the basis of this context unit is, especially world religions. And as we come into studying for reviewing this course, there are a couple of things that we can take from this context unit and have as very valuable. Definitely an understanding of the world religions or world philosophies. And there's many examples of this. Right off the top of the head, one example would be Confucianism. When you think about religion, it falls under one of our major themes in this course, which is cultural developments and interactions and how culture influences societies. Well, Confucianism is going to influence China throughout the entire course, and it's going to influence in lots of different ways. And so a good, solid basis of understanding of Confucianism is going to help you answer questions in any unit because of that. So there are some important things to take away from this context unit. Also, guys, remember that at the end of this screencast, there is a slide that has the SAQ that you guys need to complete with your partner. Okay, so let's get into this, the context lessons. So first of all, this is going to be a very, very important thing throughout our review of WAP, the WAP themes. This is almost should be like a checklist to you guys, where every time that we study a society up throughout all of the units, you want to be thinking about, can I answer a question on each of these themes about this society? Like if you were tested on the United States between 1750 and 1900, and they asked you questions about any of these topics: how were humans interacting with the environment? What was the cultural developments and interactions? How was it being governed? What was the government doing? What were the economic systems? Those sort of things. Those are things that you should be able to answer. And so these very much are like, a checklist, so to speak, of knowing what we need to know about the societies that we learn about. The number one theme that the College Board gives us is humans and the environment. In the beginning, it's going to be all about environment shaping humans, how humans live. And then as time goes on and more technology is adopted, humans start to have more of an interaction on their environment, changing their environment in a number of different ways. Cultural developments and interactions, this is a huge one. What are the ideas, beliefs, and religions of certain peoples, and how does that impact their society? We also have how that impacts other societies, because we have trade through the Silk Roads and travel, which creates diaspora communities or creates syncretic religions, all of these things. So these are things that the College Board really focuses on as important and could ask you guys questions on. Governance, and that really could also be put as politics, state formation, expansion, decline. Also, how do states govern their peoples? They create bureaucracies. What laws do they have? What kind of taxation? All those sort of things. It's obviously a big focus of the class. Economic systems. And when we think about economic systems, we've been talking about very modern economic systems as of late, things like the stock market, things about capitalism and subsidies for private companies, all those things. But don't forget that under that as well, when we go back to our first units, an economic system can be land-based Silk Road trade, Indian Ocean trade, those sort of things. So we have to trace how economies develop throughout the course and throughout world history. Another big one is social interactions. How do each society, how do they group their members, and how does then a social standing of a group influence how interactions come with that group? One big example of this is women. Tracing women and the rights of women and the powers of women throughout different societies. There's going to be a lot of overlap between culture and social interactions, because so much of that has to do with the culture of the society. And then last and not least, technology and innovation. We learn about a lot of different innovative techniques and technologies that completely change really all of these things above. When we talk about, maybe perhaps the best example is the Industrial Revolution, and how it changes the social structure, how it changes the economy, how it changes how government interacts, right? And of course, the environment, all those things. And so, we want to keep track of these themes as we go through the review, so that we can really better understand exactly what kind of questions they can ask us. Okay, so the course really starts like the very, very beginning of the prologue of our AMSCO book is starting just where human beings and modern human beings come from. And the oldest remains were found 4.4 million years ago in Eastern Africa. Also, the second oldest remains are found in Eastern Africa, a skeleton called Lucy. And so, therefore, that time period, about 2.5 million years ago to about 8,000 BCE, so talking a long time ago, is what we call the Paleolithic Age. The Paleolithic Age means the Old Stone Age. And at this point, we don't even have farming. Every single person is a hunter-forager. Typically, the men are hunting, the women are foraging, and there is no classes. It's a classless society. It's an egalitarian society, although perhaps in the events of which people had to defend themselves, they turned to the men, and therefore many of the societies were probably patriarchal. Nonetheless, we really didn't have social diversification. We had people just simply going out and doing the one job that everybody had, which was going and looking for food. And that really influenced all of everyday society. They couldn't travel in huge groups because that would put too much of a strain on the food supply. And therefore, they traveled in smaller groups called kinship groups. Bigger kinship groups were called tribes. They would move from place to place, following the food, following especially animals. And in doing so, sometimes they would come to an area where there was not as much food supply, and there would be a different group of people that were moving out of that area. And oftentimes they would trade people in that sense, literally taking people from the bigger group and putting it to the smaller group, so there's not to put big strains on the food supply. But when this happened, it spread ideas, technology, religions. The biggest religion of this time period was animism, or the belief that all things, including animals, but also nature, had spirits and had some sort of spiritual impact. Okay. Why are people moving around, and is there a method to the madness? Yes. As the earth warms and cools, that is going to affect the animal and the plant life. When things get hotter, animals and plants will move further away from the equator. When things get colder, plant life is going to flourish only near the equator. Therefore, the animals will come to the plant life. And there we go. We've got shifting. We've got migration. And so because of this, that's going to influence where humans migrate. And so we saw people move out of Eastern Africa and go throughout the world. But of course, the question is, how did they then get over to the Americas? Well, in one such time period, one of the four great ice ages of the world, the ocean level fell about 400 feet, and it merged a little strait over here, the Bering Strait, in which people could move from what is now eastern Siberia across into modern day Alaska, and then move into the Americas. And nomadic people just following animals came across this land, and that, of course, then starts to populate the Americas. Now, this Paleolithic era, the Stone Age, or really the Old Stone Age is called, is really just about developing tools to fit the environment. As people moved from place to place out of Eastern Africa, they came to all sorts of different environments. They came to tundras and deserts, very cold areas, very hot areas. And so each place they went, they had to adapt to their environment. They made tools, they made spears and harpoons to hunt big game, or perhaps they created digging tools to dig for insects or to harvest berries, that sort of things. The biggest Paleolithic accomplishment was to controlling fire. They did that for protection. They did that to burn their meats, to cook their meat. They did it to for lights, all sorts of things. And then we have a change into the Neolithic Age. And the reason being is that people at all points, different points of the world, develop agriculture. There's a discovery, sometimes 3,000, sometimes 1,000 years apart in different parts of the world, where people realize that agriculture is possible, that by putting things in the ground and watering it, that they can grow new plant life. And that, of course, the immediate change is that people that have been wandering around the world for all this time are now going to stay in one place and start to utilize farming and pastoralism as major sources of food. And so, with that, the immediate change is now there's a surplus of food for the first time ever. We have more food than we need to consume. And with that, now not everybody needs to be someone looking for food. Now we have the possibility for new professions, what we call social diversification. And that happens as a result. We see population spike all around the world. And this, again, doesn't happen all around the same time. The domestication of animals is another cause of this, or another effect of this, where we see wild animals being tamed, the dog, the goat, horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, all of these things for the purpose of protection and especially for providing food. Horses and cattle are going to be really big in using for the first plows to be able to plow the ground to encourage agriculture. That's going to take place in the Eastern Hemisphere. In the Western Hemisphere, they didn't have those sort of things, and so they had to get really creative with how they did their farming. Then some groups relied completely on the domestication of animals. And so we saw pastoralism, and that's still a nomadic way of life where you're domesticating animals to move from place to place. However, this is going to be our first big impact on the environment, because if you have all these animals and you move to a place, they're going to eat all the grass or the whatever foliage that they're eating, and that's going to have an effect on the environment. Our biggest and best example of a large pastoralist group, guys, is something that we'll cover in our first unit, which is the Mongols. Our Mongols were nomadic pastoralists in a big way. Okay. So that Neolithic revolution, also called the agricultural revolution, the starting of farming, is going to change just about everything in society. We see people now doing something other than hunting and gathering. That's the specialization of labor. We now see, because people are staying in one place, the growth of towns and cities. Now we have the need to protect our resources. We need governments. We also see religion become, just from spiritual beliefs in animals and what have you, to becoming organized religions with a priest class or a clergy class. And then we see now with new innovations with things like inventors and artisans and those sort of things. During the Neolithic innovation, we saw our first plow pulled by a draft animal. Depending on where that was, in Europe, it might be a horse. In the Middle East, it might be a horse or a camel. Or, for instance, over in China, you might have a water buffalo, those sort of things. Also, we saw the wheel invented during the Neolithic Revolution, so you can move things from place to place. Again, that's only in the Eastern Hemisphere. And then we see the first textiles, animal hair into cloth, so that people are having clothing and blankets and those sort of things. And then metallurgy, the science of metals, which is actually really huge, because for many, many years, thousands of years, warfare is going to be won by the society that has the strongest metals, the weapons with the strongest metals. We'll see that tin and copper together are melted into bronze, and the first bronze weapons will become the most dominant weapons of the era, especially in China, with the Zhou dynasty being this ultimate power throughout the world because of its bronze weapons. So metallurgy, very important. And then we talk about our 4 river valley civilizations, 4 places throughout the world in which we see the first what we would call civilizations, advanced societies. And they have many commonalities despite really not interacting very much with each other. And the first is the fact that they're all in river valleys. They all are going to depend on agriculture. All of them are polytheistic, and that's interesting because obviously, for instance, Egypt and China aren't communicating together about their beliefs and religion, and yet we do see lots of similarities in beliefs, and these beliefs are going to come up because of their interactions with the environment and how they try to explain things that they can't explain in the environment. And then with the growth of these organized religions, we see religious elites emerge. What are most of these early river valley social structures looking like? first of all, now that we see social diversification or social stratification, we see that we see a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. People that have what we would consider high prized um, professions are going to now get more wealth, whereas the group that perhaps either farmers or slaves down at the bottom are going to see that they're very, very much out of power and wealth because of their social standing with their profession. We also see the first growth of nobles, which become hereditary wealthy landowners, people that control land and then pass down their land to their children. Because they have wealth, they're going to start to raise up in society. We see this is exactly what social diversification is. And this is showing the graphic over here showing Sumer, which is Sumeria. This is in Mesopotamia. This is over here in the Middle East. In every place that we go around the world, we see two things. One is that the presence of slavery is huge. Slaves were taken as foreign prisoners, or there were people that could not pay their debts. That's going to especially be prominent when we see, disasters, flooding, that sort of thing, flooding people's crops. They can't pay their taxes, which usually started in grain or some other type of crop. They could become slaves. And then the other thing was patriarchal societies. Women from the very beginning are not placed in positions of power. They're not given education. They didn't have a say in marriage. And this is going to hold true in our river valley societies all over the world. Although there are a few exceptions. In the Americas, we still are staying very egalitarian. Women had pretty much the same social standing as men. And then in Egypt, even though Egypt was very, very patriarchal in many ways, we did see two women rise to all the way up to the top part of society as the pharaoh. Okay, our first major religion that we discuss is Judaism, starting with the Hebrews. And we see a Jewish state founded back in 1200 BCE in Canaan, which is present day Israel and Palestine. They were earlier called the Israelites, later they're called the Jews. And they start to practice the religion that we now call Judaism because we have some sacred scriptures that are now written down in what we call the Old Testament. And we are founded by a guy by the name of Abraham. Canaan was founded by Abraham because this is a religious center for three major religions: Christianity, Islam, and of course Judaism. Abraham is viewed as really the first prophet in all three of those places because he sets down the fundamental basis of what becomes Judaism and monotheism more specifically. Monotheism, we know that that's the worship of a single God, and this is very unique to the time period because our river valley civilizations are all polytheistic. We see the religious elite up at the top are in the places that they are in these polytheistic places because they can predict, or they can say that they can predict when floods are coming, or how to appease the gods and protect them from the environment, so be it. The Jews viewed this differently. They said that there was only a single God and that God was not angry and wrathful, but instead more orderly and just. However, we did see a severe drought that forced the Jews to migrate to Egypt. And when they arrive in Egypt, we see the first of a very many enslavements and discrimination and prejudice against the Jews. The Egyptians are going to enslave them for not worshiping their pharaoh and worshiping their Egyptian gods. And finally, the Hebrews are going to be led out of Egypt by Moses. They go back to modern day Israel and Palestine. Moses is also going to introduce the Ten Commandments, which has now become very, very important in the studies of Christianity and Judaism. Now, one of the major important things of this context unit that starts in this context unit, but really carries on throughout most of the course, is the Jewish diaspora. Even though Jews return to Canaan, return to their homelands, they are, again, almost immediately conquered by a different group, the Babylonians. When the Babylonians conquer them, they start to once again enslave them. And this is going to cause the Jews to flee, and they're going to flee throughout the known world at this stage, which is the Mediterranean. They're going to make it over to Western Europe, into modern day Spain and France and Italy and Southeastern Europe and places like Greece and all these places. And they're going to bring their religion with them. And so this is the first great migration and spread that occurs, what we would call diffusion of a religion, spreading the religion throughout the world. Okay, so then we go to the classical age, which again is far before our course starts. But there is some fundamental things that we need to understand from the classical age. This was a really fun age to teach about. Unfortunately, we don't learn about it anymore in the modern world history class, but this was the age of empires. There were some great, great empires that emerged out of this. The first really was the Greek Empire, which was a very interesting, I mean, can we call it an empire? While it was controlled by lots of Greek city-states, they were just that. They were city-states that shared common culture and religion. And many times those city-states were at war with each other, but other times they're allied with each other. And they did put down their swords and their differences and come in and celebrate the Olympics together, which was actually a religious gathering. But Greece is kind of our exception to the rule in this time period. Greece was city-states because of its terrain, because it was so mountainous and rugged. It was difficult for one government to rule over all of the different places in Greece. But we see that after that point, we see lots of major, large empires created that are governed by one government, and a lot of the time one person. First, we see the Hellenistic Empire, which is Alexander the Great storming in and conquering these huge amounts of land in here. And then we see the Roman Empire. The Greeks, I should mention, battled against the Persian Empire, especially the Achaemenid Empire with the great Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes. The Persian Empire in the Middle East, guys, it should be mentioned that they were very, very culturally tolerant and religiously tolerant. And those religious tolerance beliefs actually stayed in the Middle East and influenced the first caliphates, the Muslim caliphates that emerged there. This is also the time period, guys, where several other world religions are created and spread. Christianity, Hinduism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and we see our first interregional trade, especially along the land-based Silk Roads. So both of these things, world religions created and spread and interregional trade, are really hand in hand, because the reason why religions spread in this time period is the emergence of the Silk Road trade. Okay, one thing that I remind us in this context unit, guys, is that we do have these world regions that we do need to know. We need to know these because the College Board may ask you guys questions on the AP test where they'll say, identify one way in between 1200 to 1450 that people in the Middle East interacted with their environments. And you would need to know what civilizations were in the Middle East or Latin America or East Asia, these sort of things. So important, obviously, to be able to answer questions. We also see a closer look here, kind of modern day societies and what breaks into what. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire came in and conquered Alexander the Great's empire. And this is a region, this is an empire that spans multiple regions. It's in Western Europe, it's in Eastern Europe, it's in the Middle East, it's in Northern Africa. This is truly an empire. And that's what a definition of an empire is. An empire is a kingdom that rules over other kingdoms of different ethnicities or cultures. And the Roman Empire was incredibly influential for lots of reasons. They spread so much of their culture, their languages, Latin, those sort of things are spread throughout the world. And the Roman Empire is a complex empire as far as religion, because it goes from a very polytheistic empire to a very monotheistic empire. The Roman empire, and really I'm saying empire, but that even is historically inaccurate because it started as the Roman Republic and then turned into the Roman Empire. But regardless, this large Roman Empire at first started as very polytheistic, and it stayed polytheistic because when it conquered the Greeks, it pretty much stole their religion. It took all of the Greek gods and they gave them Roman names, and they worshipped these gods, and they also worshipped in festivals. They also came in and worshipped in religious holidays that were led by a chief priest called the Pontifex Maximus. However, they were also very tolerant. They allowed other peoples that they conquered to continue to practice their own religion as long as they also followed the Roman religion. And that is where we see another conflict emerge, because when the Romans come into the Middle East, they encounter the ancient Canaan, which of course has our Jews. And that's where the Romans come in. They conquer the capital, Jerusalem. And the Romans are interested in this new religion that the Jews are practicing, or I should say, very old religion that the Jews are practicing. And the Romans say, yes, you can continue to practice that religion, but you must also worship our religion and come to our religious ceremonies, follow the chief priest. And the Jews, of course, are going to refuse. They're going to say, no, there was only one God. There was not other religions. And so the Romans are going to persecute against them. And once again, that is going to further the fleeing of Jews throughout the known world, furthering that Jewish diaspora. At this time period, we see one of the most influential figures in world history step on the stage, and that is Jesus, who starts as a Jewish preacher and a religious leader. However, he is going to, at the time, break away from Judaism, because he is claims that he is the Son of God. And so, with that happens, there is going to be a disagreement with other Jews on how to best worship God and who he is as a role of the savior of humanity sent by God. And so while at the time he kind of views, we start to see a split between his views and the views of normal Jews. That isn't really a known difference of Christianity. I should say the religion of Christianity starts with Jesus, but it isn't recognized as a new religion until really 50 or 60 years later. At the time period, people start to follow Jesus because of the miracles that he is performing along his travels. And these miracles are going to gather followers. And we see many different followers, including Peter, who is one of Jesus's first followers, and went and preached the ideas of Jesus in Rome. And then Paul, another one, who preached the ideas of Jesus throughout the Mediterranean. And it's really the followers of Jesus that are going to start to collect his teachings and the stories of his miracles and put them into text, which will become the basis of Christianity. And by the end of the first century, Christianity emerges as a distinct form of Judaism and becomes its own religion at this point. And this religion, we've seen so many different religions and beliefs throughout this time period, but this religion is going to become immensely, immensely popular with the people of Rome, the Roman Empire. And it's going to be popular because it focuses on living simply, worship, and reflection. Especially living simply, guys, that idea, because so many people in the Roman Empire did not have wealth and prosperity. They were poor. And Jesus was poor, and he preached a very simple lifestyle of worship and reflection, and said that after life, there is an afterlife, and it's full of happiness and peace. And so for many people in society that didn't have material wealth in their lives, they looked at this religion as an escape, as something that appealed to them. And so Christianity is going to stick as a new religion because it appealed to so many people in the Roman Empire. Followers would build monasteries where they could devote their lives to Christianity. And it's going to spread, and it's going to spread especially with the urban poor and the slaves and women, anyone without power. But like Judaism, it's going to run into a similar problem. Our Christians are going to refuse to worship those Roman deities, and we're going to see the Roman government view it as a very dangerous religion that kind of infringes upon their power. Especially the emperor's power. And so we're going to see emperors resist the spread of Christianity. One such example, most famously, is Emperor Nero, who blames the Great Fire of Rome on the Christians and has thousands imprisoned and tortured and killed. But this is only going to strengthen Christianity because Christians are going to teach martyrdom as Jesus did, dying for the sins of humanity. Many Christians are going to follow suit with this persecution and rather die than give up their beliefs. And this is going to increase the popularity of Christianity so much that when we get to the 4th century, we have an actual Roman emperor convert to Christianity. And this really cements Christianity as a religion that is there to stay in the Roman Empire. And in fact, Constantine is going to issue the Edict of Milan, which declares religious tolerance for Christianity. It becomes the official religion of Rome, and this becomes kind of the pillar of Christianity throughout the world. And Rome becomes the holy city of Christendom at this stage. Ironically, though, there's lots of unrest by this stage in the Roman Empire, and the wealth of the Roman Empire is not where it formerly was due to many reasons: plague, and corruption, and wealth inequality. And so there start to be invaders, Germanic, nomadic invaders coming in and starting to wage war upon Rome. And Constantine sees this, and so he's going to move the capital from Rome over to Constantinople. At the time it was called Byzantium. He renames it Constantinople, and that becomes the center of the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. Silk Roads, such an important concept, guys, and I know you guys know the Silk Roads. We don't really have to do huge amounts of review on this one, but Silk Roads are important because it checks so many boxes, guys. It has to do with economy, obviously, because it's revolved around trade. And we see each of the different regions of the world, because of their environments, have specific things to trade that are desired in other parts of the world. And so we see the rise of the wealth of merchants at this stage. But we also see that with the Silk Roads comes the exchange of ideas, of culture, of technology, of religion. And it's the Silk Roads, guys, that are going to spread these new religions throughout the world, especially, of course, Christianity, which is Rome is the very, very eastern part of the Silk Roads, and it's going to move all throughout the world this way. When it makes its way down to Arabia, it will influence the development of Islam, and it makes its way all the way over to China and all the way beyond into Southeast Asia. The Silk Road trade, as I just mentioned, ideas, technology, disease is another one, of course. That's obviously very prevalent, leads to the end of the Roman Empire. What are things that are desired in Rome? Silk and spices. Silk, of course, will be coming from East Asia, from China, and spices will be coming over from South Asia, India. Gold, of course, from Africa. Silk trade is going to make China very, very wealthy, guys. When we talk about the wealth of the world in our first units of study, it's almost always centering in China. China has so many goods that the rest of the world desires. Also, new technology from Asia, like stirrups, which are going to revolutionize the use of horses, those sort of things. But the decline of the Roman Empire is going to come about, especially because of these Silk Roads, because of epidemics. Smallpox, the big killer, it's going to come in and kill about 1/4 of the entire empire's population. And with the lack of people healthy and ready, we see less trade, less wealth. I mean, geez, guys, talking about the effects of epidemics and pandemics on the economy. Obviously this stuff is very relevant right now. And when a state loses lots of money and the economy loses money, the state doesn't have enough money in its vaults to be able to pay things that it was paying for previously, such as the army. And we see soldiers not being paid. Armies aren't going to defend the borders. They're not going to put their own lives at stake. And so with that, we see Germanic invaders come in, and that leads to the fall of Rome in 476. Rome is going to be completely conquered by Germanic tribes, especially the Huns with Attila the Hun, and they come in and they seize Rome. And so the Western Roman Empire, as we know it, is now conquered. And it's at this stage, guys, that Western Europe in general, because so much of it was controlled by Rome, the Roman Empire, now falls into a time period that is called the Dark Ages. This is where all of the wonderful civilization of Rome and the tax supported streets, and all of these things kind of fall into disarray, and that state sponsored trade disappears. And we see feudalism emerge, where we see all these different smaller societies seize power in their little regional areas, and they start speaking their own languages only, and they start trading only within their kingdom. And that's going to lead to a general decline in the wealth and the influence of Western Europe for a long time. And that's called the Dark Ages, right? Now, over in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, the Byzantine Empire through Constantinople still remains, and it remains actually quite wealthy and powerful. Constantinople isn't going to fall until 1453, which is during our course, and that's going to be from Mehmed II coming in and forming the Ottoman Empire, which, of course, is a major world event. Now we are going to talk about India, and we're going to talk about China, and then we are done. So first of all, India, guys, is very important geographically. It's often described as the middle of the Silk Roads. And at the time period, guys, especially early on, that we don't see yet Indian Ocean trade. When Indian Ocean trade occurs, India is going to become especially wealthy because it has this, great big subcontinent in which it is, has so many accesses to the Indian Ocean, and therefore becomes an enormously popular trading center. However, India, even in the Silk Road trade, land-based was a very popular place because it had so many highly desired goods, including spices. It's also because it's in between China and the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire. It's going to be a place stopped by multiple merchants. Merchants are going to come in and stop in India, and they're going to bring with them religion and technology and goods and all of these things. So India, lots of syncretism, lots of diffusion. The people living in India were a group called the Dravidians, but the Dravidians were conquered by a much more influential group in Indian history called the Aryans. The Aryans were lighter skinned. They settle in India, and at first they try to rule the Dravidians by creating a hierarchy based on their skin color. However, as the years went by, the intermarriage is going to erase skin color. And so because of this, religion starts to dominate the society of India. Especially because the Aryans, in trying to keep power, are going to establish some religious rules that are written down with their famous religious language called Sanskrit. And they're going to form the basis of modern day Hinduism, where there are 4 classes in society, and that the class up at the top are the Brahmins, and they're the educated in the religious texts. And that means that the people that can read Sanskrit are the highest peoples in society, the Brahmins up at the top. Okay, and then as we go further down the society through what we now call the caste system, we see the warriors and the rulers, and the Vaishyas, which are the farmers and the merchants, and then the Shudras down at the bottom. But there's a group even further that didn't come from, as the religion says, from the great powerful Brahma. There is one group that comes even further than that, below that, and that is what we call the Dalits, the outcasts, the untouchables. And the Dalits were the group that performed the worst jobs in society, like cleaning dead bodies in sewage systems or working with meats. And these peoples were considered dirty. Just by touching them would be considered dirty, and that it would pollute members of different classes. And because of this, they were segregated in society. They were thrown to live in the worst portions of India, the poorest portions of India, where roads didn't go, and it would become lack of healthcare and education would only further keep these Dalits oppressed in Indian society. They would also be looked down socially, trying to get out of their social standing, because other families, especially high-class families, wouldn't consider them to be married as a marriage choice, as a suitable spouse for their husband or wife. The origins of this caste system has now become the strongest historical continuity in India. And this becomes dominating over all aspects of Indian life. Indians are born into a caste. They're born there, right? And so when they're born into a segment of India, they are kept in this geographical location. They're born into their caste. They are born into an occupation inherited from their parents, or especially from their fathers. And because they're born into a specific area, and because India is segregated by caste, they only largely interact with people from their caste And that means that this kind of reinforces this long social hierarchy, this religious hierarchy. Um, we see that within the caste, there's multiple professions within caste, and so subcasts start to form depending on your specific profession. If you are, a blacksmith, you're in the Vaishya caste, but your jati is other blacksmiths, right? And so we see these subcastes start to form, the jatis. Um, and that then starts to be governed with the basics of Hinduism. How do these people who are being born into specific castes, originally, how do our Aryans keep control over the people born into lower castes? Why don't these people rebel against the people that are in the higher castes? There is religious reason for this. The religious reason is the basics of Hinduism. So the Atman, or every person has a spiritual life. Everything has a spiritual life, an inner self, a soul. And after the body dies, the soul remains. The soul will continue to come back again and again and again. That's called reincarnation. It's going to enter many bodies. But the goal of this reincarnation is that eventually the soul will have enough good karma to be able to reunite with the Brahma, to release the soul cycle and end this long spiritual life and unite with the Brahma together, and we call the nirvana, almost like a heaven situation. And so the goal of Hindus is to get good karma. They need to have good intent and actions that is going to allow them to get good karma and thus reach the moksha, the nirvana, the end of the soul cycle. But how do you get good karma? That's the big question. How are you eventually going to be able to end the soul cycle and reach the moksha? Well, to do that, you need to perform your dharma, which is down at the bottom and is a huge concept in Hinduism. Dharma really comes down to doing the duty of your caste, fulfilling your caste duties without worrying about material success. That is the early Hinduism in India. And so by doing the dharma of your caste, the duty of your caste, that is what is going to give you good karma and eventually reach the moksha. So even if you are born into a lower caste, you can eventually be reborn into a higher caste and eventually reach the moksha by simply doing the duty of your caste. That's what keeps everyone in line in Indian society, and therefore dharma is a very central and important portion of Hinduism. But Buddhism is also going to emerge, also in India, and this is going to largely base a lot of its beliefs off of Hinduism. We see the founder is Siddhartha Gautama, who on a long walk came to realize that the world is full of suffering. And Siddhartha Gautama sits down below a tree and meditates for 3 days straight and comes to realizations called the Enlightenment. At that stage, Siddhartha Gautama is no more. Now he is the Buddha. And the Buddha has 4 noble truths in which Buddhists are supposed to live their lives by. And that first is that all life involves suffering. And suffering comes from world pleasures and material things that people want, that are going out, material objects, luxuries, these things. And that because there is a constant desire for these luxury items, these world pleasures, these material things, that is the source of suffering. And suffering can end if people meditate and eliminate one's earthly desires for these things. They need to meditate, they need to reflect, they need to detach themselves from these desires, and that's what will bring about the end to the soul cycle. So we do have a soul cycle, we do have the Atman, or the spiritual soul, but this one's different. Buddhism isn't saying that you need to do the duties of your caste in order to reach the end of the soul cycle. Instead, you need to renounce all of the world pleasures and material things. And so we have a fundamental difference between Buddhism and Hinduism. And Although both build on inward reflection and ending the cycle of reincarnation, the major difference is that Buddhists reject the caste system. Buddhists are not performing the Dharma in the sense of doing it to do the duties of their caste. They're simply trying to live life simply and renounce worldly pleasures. And so, of course, who is Buddhism going to be popular with in India? It's going to be popular with the lower castes who don't have lots of worldly pleasures already. And so it becomes easier to renounce those worldly pleasures and believe that they can reach the end of the soul cycle. And then last but not least, we talk about China. And China, when we talk about China, guys, all year long, we will address Confucius. Confucius, of course, is such an important figure in Chinese history because he influences the philosophy, but also the politics, but also the social standing of China with his beliefs. Confucius was a government official who became frustrated with his work because he believed that the man that he worked for was corrupt. And so he traveled China. He traveled throughout China using on a water buffalo, talked to different people, gathered disciples. In that way, very much like Jesus in the sense that many of the things that he did and the things that he spoke attained him popularity and got him disciples. And it is his beliefs after he passes away, and his disciples are going to put his beliefs into a group of teachings. We won't call it a religious text, so to speak, but certainly it has, some philosophical and even religious elements to it called Analects. Analects becomes the for a lack of a better word, religious text of Confucianism, although it really isn't religious more than philosophical. Okay, so what is Confucianism? It focuses on behavior. It's not focusing on the beliefs of a god or a deity, and in fact, already the Chinese were focusing instead on honoring their ancestors and honoring ancestor spirits. Confucianism largely is going to build off of this idea. He believed that each role in society was important for a society to run. But in order for a society to function well, everyone needed to do the job in their particular place in the social hierarchy. And if they did that, they would get honor. If a farmer did their job as a farmer, or a peasant did their job as a peasant, and the ruler, the king, the emperor did their job as an emperor, then a society would be effective. And that also goes true to family standings. Family, of course, is a staple of Confucianism. It's so important that a family must be respected. The elders of the family are most important, but above even the elders of the family are the ancestors. That ancestors must be worshipped and respected, that elders must be worshipped, especially the father of the household or the grandfather of the household. And that everyone, if they follow along with tradition and the social structure, everyone should be treated fairly and equally in a society. Treat others as the way you would want to be treated. Applies to all aspects of Confucianist society. And the emperor was supposed to treat the peasant very much the same way, as long as they did their job in their specific role. And this is a quote from Analects. Good government consists of the ruler being a ruler, the minister being a minister, the father being a father, and the son being a son. This is perfectly encapsulates Confucianism in the respect of following the social structure and the tradition of one in which one's been placed in society. Now, the other element of this, well, first of all, filial piety. Of course, this is a huge element of Confucianism. It's not wealth that brings your family wealth, power, I should say. It's not wealth that brings your family power. It is instead if your family honors China by doing their job in society. A peasant family can have a tremendous amount of status in society because they honor their ancestors, they honor their elders, and they do their job in society. But Confucius also believed that the father was supposed to be the head of the household. In fact, he even designated that women had specific jobs in society like handwork and domesticity. And so Confucius, while he promotes several good ideas that influence China in very positive ways, also with his patriarchal views, is going to influence China for over 1,000 years in very patriarchal and discriminatory ways. The idea that filial piety is an important concept, just to sum it up, engage in good conduct towards your family members, worship your elders, worship your ancestors, and that will bring honor to your family. But with this idea of women, we do see that Confucianist China does bring about inferiorities to women. Women aren't educated. They're supposed to be essentially servants of their husband or the father in the household. Also, kind of unique to the Chinese societies at this stage, that the extended families would all live in one home. That it would not just be the father, the wife, and the children, but also if the parents of the family were still alive, that they would also be in the home together, and that was a way that you could respect your elders. But we also see at this stage, and not because of Confucius, but because of patriarchal principles in China, that concubines became mainstay in China, which obviously we know what concubines are, and this becomes a very, very long-lasting tradition in China that's only going to contribute to continued patriarchal views. A contemporary of Confucius was a prophet of ways called Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu starts what we now would call Taoism. And Taoism is similar in many ways. There's lots of similarities to Buddhism. One such way is that it renounces worldly possessions. It's about living simply, and often it's about living simply within nature, by seeking simplicity in nature, and that human beings constantly have to be in a balance, because there are very aggressive sides of humanity and there's very passive sides of humanity, and too much of each will stray from the path, will stray away from happiness and wisdom, and that you must find a balance between these things. And to do this, live simply and seek harmony with nature. That's what the fundamental beliefs in Taoism are. And so with this, Taoism, just like Buddhism was in India, being very popular with the lower classes, the lower caste in India, Taoism becomes very popular with the peasants in China, because peasants are often working outside. They've got a connection to natural forces and lands. And peasants are, because they're living out in these large rice paddy areas, they don't often interact with places like in the big cities or what have you, although big cities at this stage were still at a minimum. Taoism naturally starts to evolve and mix with Buddhism in 200 AD. That becomes Zen Buddhism, which we'll talk about later. Our last two slides, guys. So Han Wudi of the Han Dynasty becomes our first ruler to embrace Confucianism as a state philosophy of sorts. And he does this in two ways. The biggest way and the most important way is that Han Wudi is the emperor that introduces the civil service exam. That is a huge element of Chinese history, guys. We've got to remember the civil service examination, because it is going to, with past, bring people into the Chinese bureaucracy that becomes the best bureaucracy in the world. China's government, it earns the respect of governments around the world, because any person can enter the government by passing this civil service exam. But the key of this, of course, is that the test, the civil service exam, is based on Confucianism. And so by passing the test, you have to be well versed in the Confucian classics. Thus, people that can read, or people that have access to the Confucian classics, have a huge leg up. And so we often see that the higher classes are the people that are passing this civil service examination. And thus, Confucianism has a huge impact on the upper classes of Chinese society, where things like, for instance, Taoism may be more influential with the lower classes. Han Wudi is also going to create a national university for the study of Confucianism. So Han Wudi really is the guy that cements Confucianism in Chinese society. Xuanzang is a Chinese Buddhist monk. He is going to travel from China to India. He goes on a pilgrimage. He is going to stop along Buddhist shrines along the way. He's going to talk with Buddhist monks. He is going to bring back Buddhist texts. He's going to translate them to Chinese. Xuanzang is our quintessential bringer of Buddhism to China. This guy is responsible for bringing the first great migration of Buddhism to China, and Buddhism becomes, again, very popular with the lower classes in China. So China, a little bit complex in the religion department, or the philosophy department, because we really have three different things in China. Buddhism and Taoism, which are popular with the peasant class, the lower class. Confucianism, popular with the educated upper class, especially because of the civil service exam. All three religion philosophies reinforce living simply and not pursuing financial wealth. And therefore, we might remember that in China, merchants are actually lowest on the social structure because they're not seen as contributing things to the Chinese society. Rather, they are pursuing financial wealth through the creation of other statuses. Okay, guys, the partnered SAQ, the last thing on this PowerPoint, on the screencast, is for you guys to answer these questions with your partner. This is due before class. Second period, that means tomorrow. I need it before class starts. See you guys at 10 a.m., so I need it by 9:59 a.m. And then fourth and fifth period, I need this right before class for you guys, respectfully. Okay. Identify one comparison of how Christianity and Buddhism spread in their early years. Identify one social effect that Confucianism had on Chinese society, and then one leader that was instrumental in further cementing religion in their states. Do that on a Word document or on a Google Doc. One partner only needs to send that in to me. Make sure that you have your names on it. Make sure that you have your team on it so that I can give credit to both of you guys. Okay, guys, that's our context unit. I hope you guys learned something from that, and hopefully most of it was review. Here's just one more clip of my Google drawing that I made on the creation and spread of Judaism. You guys are doing a similar thing for your respective topics. If you forget who's on your team, go on to Schoology. I do have the teams on there for you guys for your convenience. All right, guys, signing off. Hope you learned a lot, and I will see you guys in class.